Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's always a great pleasure to come back to Russia, a country dear to my heart, for which I have fond memories as an Egyptian diplomat some 25 years ago. It's also an honor to be invited by the Russian Ministry of Defense and to participate in a session moderated by my dear friend, General Alexander Fomin, Deputy Minister of Defense. The more I think about terrorism, the more I tend to go back to Russian literature as an inexhaustible asset of inspiration. I always remember Dostoevsky's maxim, "Nothing is easier than denouncing the evildoer. Nothing is more difficult than understanding him." Thus, I keep reminding my colleagues at the Office of the Special Envoy that understanding the root causes of terrorism is an indispensable step to root out this heinous epidemic. Religious ideology based on extreme fundamentalism, the germ of which is the belief in Puritanism, perfect clarity and simplicity of right and wrong, and owning the absolute truth, is a real problem that has to do with the educational system, religious teaching, narrative, and discourse. This is a primary issue that transcends any single religion. The so-called radicalization of Islam has two main sources. One of them was captured eloquently again by a Russian novelist, Tolstoy, when he said, "If everyone fought for his own convictions, there would be no war." Studying the history of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s shows a clear case of how a certain Islamic narrative can be used to recruit and radicalize young people from all over the world to serve geostrategic interests of certain regional and global powers. In this respect, Daesh, ISIS, is not an exception. The second source of radicalization is directly linked to traumatization. In most culture, the proximity of death will focus minds on the transcendent. Faith is intensified by death and the threat of death, by the pain and humiliation of killing and torture. Thus, when a nation is splintering, religious identities are reinforced. When I hear the most famous Syrian slogan sung during demonstrations, "Ya Allah, malna ghirak," Ya Allah, "Oh God, we have nothing but you," I immediately remember the Western proverb, "There are no atheists in foxholes." An intense relationship with God becomes a survival framework for those facing extreme violence by state security apparatus. Having mentioned ideology, traumatization, and serving other interests as possible factors to explain where terrorism comes from, one has to admit Daesh is something more. Daesh is a terrorist organization, but it is not only a terrorist organization. It is a mafia adept at exploiting decades-old transnational gray markets for oil and arms trafficking. It is a semi-conventional military that mobilized and deployed foot soldiers with professional acumen. It developed a sophisticated intelligence gathering apparatus that infiltrated rival organizations and silently recruited within their ranks, taking them over, routing them in combat, and seizing their land. It is a slick propaganda machine, effective at using internet and social media and disseminating its message and calling in new recruits from different nationalities. In this sense, Daesh is a manifestation of a generational shift in terrorism in terms of technology dependency, age group, and ambition to create a transnational state. The territorial defeat of Daesh last year in both Syria and Iraq came with many lessons learned that we shouldn't forget. And I emphasize territorial defeat, as Daesh has not become extinct yet and can reemerge in different forms in the future if we do not address the factors that allowed it to survive. Let me quickly mention 4 of these reasons. First, It was a terrible mistake for some to advocate a containment strategy against Daesh or to declare that degrading Daesh would be sufficient. On the contrary, those who insisted on defeating and uprooting Daesh have proven to be fully aware of the true essence of this terrorist organization that comes with a real threat to regional as well as the international peace and security architecture. Second, Daesh was a multinational, or better to say, cross-national phenomenon that necessitated an international response, whether in terms of finance, human resources, weaponry systems, outreach, or discourse. Daesh was a globalized organization as well. A well-coordinated international campaign, as we heard from many speakers, was crucial in liberating territories Daesh once controlled in both Iraq and Syria. Third, Daesh was able to grow and flourish where state institutions were either weak or non-existent. Once the Iraqi armed forces were rebuilt and reinforced, they were able not only to regain control over their territories, but also ensure law and order in liberated areas. Vacuum is a magnet for terrorism. Fourth, perhaps the only thing more important than Daesh's defeat is to adopt a set of measures to make sure this terrorist organization will never again regain its strength. This requires a stabilization plan with early recovery programs that enable refugees and internally displaced persons to return home. It also requires a sustainable, peaceful settlement that opens the door for a new chapter in Syrian history, a chapter free of extreme ideologies and traumatization arising from disregard for human dignity. Let me now turn to the political settlement issue and the role of the United Nations in realizing it. As you all know, Security Council Resolution 2254 indicates that a political settlement should include free and fair elections pursuant to a new constitution under the supervision of the United Nations to be held to the highest degree of international standards of transparency and accountability, with all Syrians, including members of the diaspora, eligible to participate. This process must unfold within a safe, calm, and neutral environment. To that end, the Office of the Special Envoy has conducted so far 9 rounds of intra-Syrian talks revolving around essential principles and 4 baskets, or thematic areas, under negotiation. The so-called Living 12 Essential Principles seek to embody end-state commonalities that can be shared and offer an enduring perspective on the vision of a future that can be shared by all Syrians. One can imagine these principles as the backbone of any permanent or transitional constitution in the future. The 4 baskets deal with governance, constitution, elections, and counterterrorism, and security governance and confidence-building measures. While the UN was able to partially engage both the government and the opposition in discussing some of the 12 essential principles, it proved to be extremely difficult to stimulate real negotiations on constitutional reform, which is considered to be the natural gateway for any credible elections or meaningful good governance to take place in the future. This was the environment when Russia, supported by 2 other guarantors of the Astana process, Iran and Turkey, came up with the idea of convening a Congress for the Syrian National Dialogue in Sochi at the end of January, a conference in which 1,500 participants participated. Let us recall, only a UN-brokered process will be seen by the Syrians as impartial and will attract regional and international legitimacy required. That is why the UN worked with the Russian Federation to make sure the following 3 goals were achieved in Sochi. First, the Living 12 Essential Principles I referred to earlier were embodied word for word in the final statement adopted by the Congress. Second, the final statement emphasized that any final agreement on the Constitutional Committee is to be reached in a UN-led process in Geneva, including its mandate, terms of reference, rules of procedure, and selection criteria for its composition. And third, the Constitutional Committee was agreed in Sochi would at the very least comprise the government, opposition representatives in the inter-Syrian talks, Syrian experts, civil society, independents, and women. Care would be taken to ensure adequate representation of Syrian ethnic and religious components. The UN Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, and his team are determined to ensure that all Syrians will define their own future. The Constitutional Committee should be composed of all segments of society inside and outside Syria. UN-supervised presidential and parliamentary elections will open new spaces for Syrians to shape the political and socio-economic future of their country. Today, leaders of Russia, Turkey, and Iran are meeting in Ankara. As I represented the United Nations in the last ministerial meeting of the three co-guarantors in Astana in mid-March, I can assure you that the UN is looking forward to work hand in hand with these countries in realizing three main goals in Syria: kick-starting the constitutional reform process under the auspices of the United Nations in Geneva, reinforcing de-escalation zones, and promoting confidence-building measures through an effective approach to handle the issues of detainees and abductees. I do not need to convince this distinguished gathering that any cessation of hostilities or de-escalation in Syria cannot even be imagined in the absence of the three Astana guarantors. But let me go one step further to express my conviction that the only avenue to ensure a sustainable political settlement is through a UN-led process that ensures the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. This is also the consensus of the international community. Last but not least, let me say a word on reconstruction. I hear very well those who advocate reconstruction as an effective tool to prevent a Daesh comeback, especially with recent attempts to consolidate its power, whether in southern Damascus, the Euphrates Valley, or elsewhere. However, first we have to have a political settlement that everyone agrees upon, and that is internationally sanctioned. The role of the UN is central in that political settlement. But clearly the UN has a role to play in early recovery, stabilization efforts, and reconstruction, but that is linked to a settlement. I fully understand the importance of post-conflict reconciliation and reconstruction, especially with massive scale of destruction in almost every corner of Syria. I also realize that stabilization is an essential prerequisite for refugees and internally displaced persons to return to their homes. But linkage is the key word, linkage to a political settlement. We have to achieve a just and viable political settlement according to Resolution 2254 in order to bring the conflict to an end, then embark on the challenging mission of reconstruction. Once you have a settlement, the role of the UN is to bring back the country to its feet. By then, I believe the UN will not only have an obligation to do so, but also the necessary expertise and the lessons learned needed to deal with the challenge of post-conflict Syria. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by underlining that there are three key principles that govern all the efforts of the United Nations in reaching a political settlement in Syria. First, the necessity to preserve Syria's unity, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. This principle also needs to be respected by all parties engaged in Syria. Second, the dignity and well-being of the Syrian people is at the heart of all our efforts. They should live in an environment of freedom and security. Third, only Syrians will determine their future. The UN's role is to help create the necessary conditions for the Syrians to exercise their free will. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the UN, I can assure you, will leave no path unexplored, no stone unturned. This tragedy, the Syrian tragedy, has to come to an end for the sake of the Syrian people, for the stability of the region, and for peace in the world at large. I thank you very much.